give some more evidence at my future prosecution. All of this will be used against me one day. All right. It's fabulous to see all of you. I hope you're well. And let's continue and finish our discussion of book 2. And I don't mind slowing the pace a little bit in book 2, because book 2, as I've said, is so crucial. It's so important in a book that is itself one of the 5 most important books ever written in Western civilization. And it's important because several extremely important things happen that are critical to really what counts as Plato's second defense of Socrates. Some really critical things happen in book 2 that really kind of illuminate why Plato, at the end of the day, thinks what he does about the relationship between philosophy and politics, and ultimately why, in some ways, he is pessimistic about the potential for a fully just city, and even for people to be ultimately self-governing, right? So it's a heavy chapter. There are some heavy moments. There are some heart of darkness moments, as we've already started to see. And it's in book 2 where really the important things happen. So what we've seen so far is the participants in the conversation at Polemarchus's house agree to look for justice, and they start to look for it in the city. And in a very simple and organic way, they kind of articulate human nature. We're not self-sufficient, we're dependent on each other. And because we need each other to produce and do all of the important things that are necessary for complex and well-lived lives, then we come together to form cities, right? And this also is a kind of an explanation for why politics is natural for Plato, right? For Plato, so politics is natural. It's something that is kind of part of our natural condition and natural being. And so they build in a very basic and simplistic way this kind of what Socrates will later call this healthy city, this kind of healthy ideal city. And what's important here is that everybody in the conversation participates in the building of the healthy city, which means that it's apparent to everybody in the conversation, because they themselves participated in it, that they know rationally what they need to know and what they need to do to live well and to be healthy at very basic levels, right? And this was really important because it's a kind of demonstration on behalf of Plato that as rational creatures, we can think about who we are, really what our nature is, that we're not self-sufficient, we're dependent, that each of us tends to have unique natures, nature inscribes in us certain talents, and that if we cultivate those and share them, we are both just with respect to ourselves, we are fulfilling our awareness of our own nature, and we're just in a very basic way with respect to the city, because we're giving to the city what we know, what our talents are, and in giving it to the city, helping the city flourish, right? And so we know what we need to know and what we need to do to live well, and this is a core Platonic idea, right? And this goes back to the first day we've met, and it's a kind of a common theme, right? Socrates and Plato are important because they're the first to say that there's some objective truth that exists, that human beings are rational, and that reason is a kind of a capacity that gets us in contact with it. And if we get in contact and we acquire information and we apply them to ourselves, we reduce the likelihood of suffering. We reduce the likelihood of trauma and suffering born by ignorance. We can live well. We are not destined to stumble from one crisis after another, right? And this is a powerful moment. And then, as we said, and as we watched in the first part of the course, for some reason, it turns out that people either don't want political philosophy, the Euthyphro doesn't think he needs it, or at the end of the day, they can't do it, right? And yet here again in the Republic, we're at that moment, right? The participants in the conversation create a kind of simple, healthy city. Everybody knows what they need to know at a very basic level and what they need to do to live well, right? So it's not a mystery. It's right there. And yet, nonetheless, Glaucon says, look, I understand that, but it's a boring city. I understand that, but it's a boring city. Nobody wants to live there. You make these people live without relish, which means pleasure, entertainment, luxury, right? Bling, right? And again, so here we are, right? This is a kind of a critical moment. Plato is acknowledging that even though people may know by nature, and even in simplistic ways, in a day-to-day way, what they need to know and what they need to do to live well, it's still almost impossible because the passions and the appetite and the desire for things we want but don't need kind of erupt and they capture our mind. And once this kind of hunger, once this desire, this appetite, Plato loves the word appetite, this hunger for things, right? The passions, right? The desires, right? The hunger. Once this desire for things we want, the pleasures, the relish, but don't need, once that emerges into the soul, into the mind, this is the origin of suffering. Here is the origin of suffering, both inside your own mind, our own souls, and here is the origin of suffering in cities. This kind of intense, uncontrolled, desire for things, the wanting of things we don't need, and even that we don't produce on our own resources too. All right, and so this is the origin, right? This is a heavy moment because this is the origin of a kind of suffering, right? A kind of suffering individually in our own souls, right? At the root of our own personal suffering, Plato would say, right? I mean, there can be lots of reasons for suffering. I get it, I understand, but a significant source of the root of all human suffering, Plato would say, emerges, right, in the wanting of things, right, that we don't need, right, in the hunger for things we don't need, right, and the obsession with them, and that is in many ways the root of suffering, and it's the root of suffering in cities. It's a root of injustice. So now we're no longer talking about the ideal city. We're not talking about a just city. We're not talking about a healthy city. We're talking about a city that's sick, right? And now the discussion focuses, it lurches to a kind of reflection on a kind of a feverish city. All right, people aren't prepared to live in a simple kind of organic way. Okay, they're not prepared. All right. So this is a kind of a heart of darkness moment. All right, so what do we have to do now? What do we have to do now? All right, well, it's going to be a luxurious city. It's going to be a feverish city. Okay, there's no getting around it. Now, again, at a critical moment, this means already that what we're starting to see is the beginnings of this idea that at the end of the day, people may not be capable of being self-governing. Right? At the end of the day, the soul is feverish, the city is feverish, because at the end of the day, there's a likelihood, right? There's a proclivity to the fact that we may not be self-governing, right? And we may not be self-governing because we want things we don't need, right? We understand that this is a healthy way of life. This is a healthy, good way of life, but it's boring, right? And no one wants to live there. Okay, so now let's talk about the feverish city. Let's talk about the feverish life. Okay. That in and of itself, in this kind of heartbreaking way, this profound way, is a kind of admission that most people, many people, aren't capable of being self-governing, because they know what they need to know and they know what they need to do to live well, but they don't. For whatever reason, their passions control their minds, their desires and their arrogance and their narcissism and their hunger for the heroin and the bling, all these things, they drive their minds. And this is the beginning of suffering. And from suffering, from a kind of ignorance and from a kind of suffering comes injustice. All right. And so then we saw, then from here, all of these kind of extraordinary things follow. Once this moment takes place on page 49, all of these profound and extraordinary and revelatory things happen. And so Socrates is, okay, okay, let's build a feverish city. All right. Well, we now need things that we don't produce. We want things that we don't produce. We want things we don't need, and we want things we don't produce. So how the hell are we going to get those things? Well, we've got to go to war. We got to cut off a piece of our neighbor's territory, as Socrates says, right? Or we've got to send people out to the Middle East to get the oil, or to Africa to get the diamonds, to Central America to get the natural resources, whatever it is. You think about the whole history of imperialism, colonial expansion, going out to get and extract natural resources to satisfy the home country's insatiable need for more spices, more pleasures, more oil, right? This is imperialism. This is European imperialism. Okay, so now we got to go to war. So now we know the origins of war. We know the origins of war inside of our own minds. Nick Dungy's at war with himself because he wants things he doesn't need, even though he knows better, right? And cities are at war with other cities because they require things they don't need, and by the way, can't produce on their own. All right, so this is the origin of war. And then, of course, the next extraordinary step. All right, well, now we even have a more profound issue, a challenge, I suppose, because we already agreed earlier, while we were talking about the healthy city, the ideal city, that there's this kind of idea of specialization, right? Right? Part of being just with yourself and just with the city is knowing who you are and kind of identifying that talent, that ability, that aptitude that nature has inscribed in your soul, and knowing what that is and cultivating it, right? So you fulfill your own nature and you contribute that knowledge to the city. So the city flourishes. All right, so there's this idea of specialization, which means now that we're going to go to a war, we need people to fight the war. And given the whole theory of specialization, it can't be Professor Dungy. Professor Dungy can't fight the war. The accountants can't fight the war. The bakers can't fight the war. The coders can't fight the war, right? They can't fight the war. We need people to fight the war who have the nature that is suitable for fighting war. And you think, well, fuck, who is that? Right? Who the hell is that? And of course, something kind of metaphorical. It's metaphorical to be sure, but it's extraordinary. Socrates says, well, we got to find a person whose nature resembles a kind of noble dog. Right? Wow. Why? Well, because they have that kind of disposition, that nature, where you can treat them in a way, you got to train them to go and kill, right? Because these are people who are going to go and kill other people. So you and I have the shit we want but don't need, right? And so we got to train them, and to train them, that's hard, right? It's hard to train to warriors. Life is hard. They undergo very difficult training, right? And yet, despite the hardships they go through, they still have to be kind to the person who trains them, to the master. And yet they've got to be willing to be angry towards people they've never met, which is kind of what a guard dog does, right? in a strange way. And this is just mind-blowing, right? Because you think, well, who are these people in our culture? And is this happening in our culture? It's very, very profound. So now we get to yet another extraordinary moment in book 2. All right. So we have to go to war to get the things we want but don't need. We've got to find people who have the proper nature, who are willing to kill and others and sacrifice their own lives for the things we want but don't need. And this is going to require that we train them, and here we go, that we educate them. Now we're in this part in chapter 2 where Socrates breaches the entire question of the education of the guardians. Now we have to educate the guardians. We got to train. I was using the word train, right? In the book, Socrates uses the word educate. Right now, we've got to educate the guardians. And when Socrates uses the term educate the guardians, he means something kind of very abstractly what we were talking about in terms of training. Obviously, they're going to be physically trained, right? And that's what Socrates calls gymnastics in the Republic, right? They're going to live this Spartan life of radical physical discipline and training and hardships. But they also have to be educated. They have to be educated, right? Because we've got to tell them something. We got to tell them something about who they are and what they're doing, right? We got to educate them. And Socrates says their training will be in gymnastics and music. Now, very important, just a little side note here. When Socrates says in gymnastics and music, in music means speech and literally music. Okay, music is a general term that includes what will be called poetry and actual music, and we'll see that in book 4. So now here we are. It seems that we have an extraordinary problem. It seems to be the case that our passions, our desires for things we want but don't need, it seems to be the case that our passions naturally drive us to the desire and the acquisition of ever more pleasures and luxuries. And it's this movement that corrupts the soul and the individual and corrupts the city politically. And this is the origin of a kind of injustice, and this is the origin of suffering. Okay, and it is this movement which corrupts the soul and corrupts the city and makes more injustice likely. And this is the origin of suffering. Now, here's the key, right? All right, so everything that we talk about from here on out, the education of the guardians, the various classes in the city, the various noble lives, how the parts of the city relate to each other. And as I said, what we actually educate the guardians. Now, everything that takes place from here on out is an attempt to keep the feverish city as just and stable as possible. This is the key, right? Because a feverish city is happening. Right? A feverish city is happening. Now everything that is discussed concerns what do the philosopher kings, or what do we have to do to make sure that this feverish city remains as in this weird way, semi-just as possible, more on that later, and as stable as possible. All right? And so if we are going to try to salvage any justice in the feverish city, and if we're going to create any stability in the feverish city, the things that we are about to discuss from here on out become critical. They become necessary. These are the things that you would have to do if you were to create a kind of justice in the feverish city, and if you were to create a kind of order, a stability in the feverish city. Okay? And so what is going to take place from here on out is the attempt to use philosophy to create poetry, more on that in a second, to use philosophy to create poetry that serves, at the end of the day, a kind of abstract justice, and that helps keep the city stable. What we have is the kind of attempt to keep the feverish city somewhat just in its ordering, more on that later, and stable as it develops and moves through time. All right, so what sort of drastic things are necessary, right? What sort of drastic things are necessary? Now, in order to create the city, right, we have to invent a new education. Now, here's the key. And this is the moment where we return to the very first lecture. And at the very first lecture, when we met, we said, look, political philosophy is born in crisis and sets in motion crisis. And one of the examples of that crisis is the great tension between philosophy and poetry. Right? For the first part of the class, all the way up to the midterm, we saw this extraordinary conflict and this tension between Socrates and philosophy and the poets and the city of Athens, right? And we saw Socrates trying to give philosophy to the city, and we saw the poets and the city of Athens, for a whole variety of reasons, sort of resist, ultimately culminating in the execution of Socrates. And so, as we saw at the midterm, in a strange way, poetry wins, even though it loses in its victory, right? It executes Socrates. Philosophy dies. So in a way, poetry wins, even though it loses in its victory, of course. But this is an important moment because what we saw even at the midterm, even in and through the execution of Socrates, what we saw is that people need their poetry. People need the myth. The city needs the myth, right? In many ways, they kill Socrates, right? In an absolutely heartbreaking way from a certain point of view, right? They kill Socrates knowing he's innocent, right? They kill him knowing he's innocent. But they kill him knowing he's innocent because it's easier to kill him than face the truth of his word, right? It's easier to kill him than face the truth of what he's saying, right? So at the end of the day, people prefer their poetry. In this heartbreaking way, they prefer their ignorance. And in a more heartbreaking way, even the suffering that derives from that ignorance. They prefer it, as opposed to having to face what is true but extraordinarily difficult. Right? And again, this is, you should be crying. If you're crying, I can't see you, but if you're crying, it's permitted. Right? This is, and by the way, we know that. How many people do we know that prefer, ignorance is such a hard word, excuse me, but how many people do we know who prefer what's familiar to them, or what's comfortable to them, or what they know, or what they think serves them in limited ways, even though it's crushing them in bigger ways? How many people do we know like that? Right? And in a profound way, we've got a whole fucking culture like that now. We've produced a whole culture like that. Right? And so this is just a really profound moment. This is why Plato's Plato. And so we've seen the victory of poetry, and now even in the Republic, because of the emergence of the passions and because of the emergence right? Of this desire for things we want but don't need. And now we've got these guardians and we have to educate them. Now we have to return to poetry, right? Now we have to return to poetry. The city needs poetry. Whatever we're gonna tell the guardians, however we're gonna educate the guardians, what are we gonna tell them? Literally, what are we gonna educate them with? What stories, what poems, what myths, right? So now the participants in this conversation have to turn to a discussion of education. And in the Republic, education will be conveyed through poetry. In the Republic, right? Because they invent a new poem. The would-be philosopher kings who are the founders of this little city that's happening, they have to invent a new poem. They have to invent a new poem. Something that is easy for people to understand, right? Like what Socrates gave Crito at the end of the Crito, the story of the laws, right? That little story of the laws that Socrates gives Crito at the end of the Crito. It's kind of a little poem, right? It's a little myth. It's not true. Socrates doesn't believe it, but he gives it to his friend Crito because it's easy for him to understand. And hopefully, because it's easy for him to understand, he'll kind of do the right thing and not be in so much trouble. So the education that takes place in the Republic of the Guardians is a kind of poetry. And what we see in the Republic is Plato using poetry. What we see in the Republic is Plato using poetry for the benefit of philosophy. Let me repeat, critical moment. What we see in the Republic is Plato using poetry for the benefit of philosophy. What we see in the Republic is Plato admitting, okay, the city needs poetry. People need poetry. Why do they need poetry? Because despite the fact that they know what they need to know and know what they need to do to live well, they don't do it because they want things. They want pleasure. They want relish. Okay. All right. So they're not self-governing. They're not self-governing. Crito wasn't self-governing. All right. So now what do we give them? We have to give them a poem, right? But now that poem will be informed by philosophy. So Plato's approach to education, right? The education that happens now from here on out remains or retains the poetic form. But it is guided by philosophy, right? It was guided by philosophy. Plato puts poetry and music into the service of philosophy in order to help people know who they are and what they're supposed to do, so they don't cause crisis to themselves and the city. Plato puts poetry and music into the service of philosophy, right? Now, again, still a kind of a shattering moment. Sorry if I'm boring you with this, returning to this. But this think about what this means, right? This means, right, people aren't self-governing. They're not capable of doing philosophy directly. And so whatever you give to them through the education, through the poetry, through the myth, it has to be something that's entertaining to them, that's pleasurable to them, that they can understand. And yet, in some ways, still convey some true things. Right? And again, it makes you wonder about this culture. The way things are conveyed, and even in this culture, through entertainment. You think about Jon Stewart conveying important political ideas or ideas of political commentary through comedy, right? You just think of this culture. You even think of news now as entertainment. You wonder these connections. All right. So again, Plato puts poetry and music into the service of philosophy. The philosopher kings will create a new poem, a new myth for the city. All right. Now, one more thing, especially for the guardians, this education, this new poem, this education, in both what we're going to tell them and what we're going to do to them, and we'll see that in book 5, right, is especially critical for the guardians, right, because the guardians represent the most single dangerous political problem human beings face. And what is that? Well, we are training a group of people, right, to go and kill other people for the things we want and don't need. Right? Right? That's what we're doing. And the danger here is, if you don't educate them properly, is one day they're going to wake up and they're going to say to themselves, we're well-trained killers. We have the power. We've got the tanks. We've got the weapons. We've got the training. We've got the strategy. We've got the intelligence services. We're a very powerful force or element in this society. What is going to stop us from wanting the wealth, wanting the political power? What's going to stop us, right? What's going to stop us from wanting to rule? Right? And by the way, this isn't an abstract question. Just look at military tyrannies in South America, Central America. This is a common 20th century, 19th and 20th century issue all around the world. Military strong men who've been brought up through the military process, trained killers, right? Control of the military. And one day they say, why am I living in the barracks? I want to live in the presidential palace. Right? And they just roll the tanks. And so this is a huge issue. And it's critical to Plato, right? Plato is absolutely clear. We are training people to constitute an extraordinarily powerful element in the whole city. In fact, it's their job to go and get the things we want but don't need. And they're going to be trained. They're going to be trained to go get things that we want. But at the end of the day, the most dangerous thing is if they're sitting in their barracks and say, no, I want what they have. I want what Nick Dungy has. I want what George Clooney has. Oh, I want to live in the White House. Right? You've got to train people who are trained to go get the things you want but don't need, but those people can never want what you have. Right? As soon as the military wants what the rest of the society has in terms of wealth or power or political power or influence or prestige or celebrity, as soon as the military in any society wants the things the rest of the society has, you're in trouble. You're in trouble. And again, this isn't even an abstract idea. Take any comparative politics class. at CSUN and just read the history of Central and South American military dictatorships. Period. So this is a huge problem. The guardians must be educated in a certain way, so they don't want and don't take what the city possesses. By the way, so they remember who their friends are. So they know, and they never forget who their friends are and who their enemies are. All right. So let's do it. Page 54. Top of 54, talking about educating the guardians. But how exactly will they be reared and educated by us? And so, okay, so we got to educate the guardians. How the hell are we going to do it? This is what we're talking about. But how exactly will they be educated by us, the potential philosopher kings? And does our considering of this issue, how we educate them, right? And does our thinking about how we educate them contribute anything to our goal of discerning that for the sake of which we are considering all things? In what way justice and injustice comes into being in a city? All right. And Glaucon said, yes, that's what we're going to do. We have to do this. All right. And then 5 lines down, Socrates says, and here, okay, here's the beginning. Here's the beginning of the noble lies. Here's the beginning of a poetry that is a myth, but informed by philosophy, and therefore serves the benefit of whom or to whom one is giving the noble lie. Remember the noble lie? What is irony? Irony is the writing and the saying of one thing, but with the intention of something else for the benefit of to whom you are speaking. Remember that? The whole damn book, the whole Republic is ironical. Okay? Right? Irony. The writing or saying of one thing with the intention of something else. So it's a kind of a lie, but done for the benefit of the person to whom you're speaking. And why? Probably because he or she is not self-governing. They're not, for whatever reason, in a position to understand what is in their own best interest or in their own highest good. They're like Euthyphro. Okay, so here we are. Here we go. Five lines down. Socrates says, come then, like men telling tales, in a tale and at their leisure. Let's educate these guardians. All right, so let's begin the education of these guardians. We must, Glaucon says. And Socrates says, what is education? Isn't it difficult to find a better one than that discovered over a great expanse of time? It is, of course, gymnastics for bodies. I've already talked about that. We're going to train them, right? And music for the soul. And as I said earlier, when they talk about music, they mean speech. They mean a kind of written poetry as well as actual music. And we'll see that in book 5. Yes, it is. And Socrates says, well, these are young guardians. Won't we begin educating in music before gymnastics? He says, well, of course. And then, of course, Glaucon or Adeimantus says, you include speeches in music, right? Written poetry, right? You include speeches in music, don't you? And Socrates says, well, yes, of course. And here we go. Here's the heart of darkness. Here's the beginning. Socrates says, well, you know, have you ever noticed how speeches have a double form? Have you ever noticed how how things have a double form. You can say one thing but intend the other, right? Have you ever noticed how speeches have a double form? The one true, the other false? Oh yes, Balkan says. Must they be educated in both, but first in the false? I don't understand what you mean, Glaucon said. Don't you? Socrates says, right? The first, he says, that first we will tell tales to children. And surely they are, as a whole, the tales, and surely they are, as a whole, false. Although there are true things in them. Ha ha ha. That is irony. That is irony. The saying of one thing with the intention of another for the benefit of the person to whom you're speaking. Right? The first we tell tales to children. Surely the tales we tell to children, right? And surely they are, most of the time as a whole, false. Though there are true things in them, right? All right. Okay, so we're going to have to tell things to the guardians that are, for the most part, false, because we're making them up. It's a new poetry, even though they have true things in them. Poetry influence, poetry governed by philosophy. Okay? And surely they are as a whole false. So whatever education the guardians are about to receive and the city is about to receive, it is on the whole what? False. It's a myth. It's a new religion. It's a new myth that's being conjured up by the philosophers. So it's clearly false, but it has true stuff in it. It's poetry informed, poetry guided by philosophy. Do speeches have a double form, the one true, the other false? Yes. And surely the tales we tell the children on the whole are false, though there are true things in them. That is true, Glaucon said. The bottom of the page, Socrates says, don't you know, therefore, and speaking of children, by the way, therefore, don't you know that the beginning is the most important part of every work? That the beginning is the most important part of every work. And that this is especially so with anything young and tender. For at that stage, it's most plastic, and each thing assimilates itself to the model whose stamp anyone wishes to give to it. Of course, we got to brainwash the kids. If you educate, brainwash, indoctrinate, however, whatever you want to fucking say at this point, children at a young age, you want them.
Professor?
Quickly?
This is like in the first apology where he was talking about his first set of accusers.
Love you so damn much. I was about to say that, but you own the day, Samantha. This is your fucking day. That's right. It's exactly what Socrates said to the jury. I have to respond to the first set because they got to you at a young age. Many of you saw this play when you were young, and it influenced you, it brainwashed you, it indoctrinated you in these prejudices against me and philosophy, and now you're here to kill me because of it. Beautiful. Perfect. Perfect. It's correct. Right? And can I slide something in that will probably cost me my job? I should probably ask Varick to stop recording right now so there's no evidence of this. Socrates says, oh, did you really stop recording, Varick? That was a joke. You didn't have to. You know how many times you've tried to fire me over the last 20 years? At least 11. At least 11. I've been on some form of academic probation for 14 straight years. And I'm still here. They haven't killed me yet. Huh? I'm doing better than Socrates. They haven't forced me to drink the hemlock yet. And Socrates says on the bottom of page 54, then shall we so easily let the children hear just any tales, right? Right? Then shall we so easily let young people, and he's talking about the guardians, but this is in general, then shall we so easily let the young guardians, the children, hear just any tales fashioned by just anyone and taken to their souls, taken to their minds, opinions for the most part opposite to those we'll suppose they must have when they are grown up. Okay, wow. So we have to censor the poetry. We have to regulate poetry. And Glaucon says, yes, of course, we won't permit the children hearing things that make them bad kids when they grow up. Right? It's literally what he's saying. First, and so here we go. Here's the censorship. Here's the new poetry of the Republic. Here's the poetry informed by philosophy. Here's poetry pressed into the service of a kind of philosophical purpose, mission. First, Socrates says, as it seems, we must supervise, we must censor, we must supervise the makers of tales. And if they make a good tale, right, one that produces, self-control, one that helps you remember who your friends are, who your enemies are, right? Things that lead to stability, political stability. And if they make fine tale, it must be approved. But if it's not, it must be rejected. We will persuade the teachers, the nurses and the mothers, right? The teachers. We will persuade nurses and mothers to tell the approved tales to their children and to shape their souls with tales more than their bodies with hands. Most of those they now tell. Okay, here's again another profound moment. Here is where Plato eliminates the Homeric traditions. Here is where Plato eliminates the Homeric traditions. Here is where philosophy eliminates an entire culture. Again, this is just profound beyond fucking belief. It's deep. Right? Right? Philosophy set out to replace the Homeric traditions. And now they're going to build a new city and do it. And by the way, this links up with something I said when we first started book 1. After the compromise, the famous compromise between power and wisdom is made on the first page of the Republic. After the famous compromise between power and wisdom is made on the first page of the Republic, and the group heads back to Polemarchus's house to have some drinks, talk a little bit, and then go back and see the party. As they're walking away, I said something. I said, look, 2 things are going to happen. They never go back to the party, and they never go back to Athens. Whatever city they end up creating in the book, The Republic, whatever city they end up creating, it's not Athens. It's not a retooled Athens. It's not a reimagined Athens. It's not a new and improved Athens. Athens is dead. And Athens is dead on page 53 because on 53, Socrates eliminates the Homeric traditions. Right? And this is heavy shit. Right? And if you wanted to be deep about this, we also kind of have been playing with this theme throughout the class that philosophy's heavy. And philosophy's involved in some heavy fucking things. In fact, as we'll see soon, when this city, in order to get this city going that they're going to build, they proposed to execute everybody over 10, just take the kids and start all over. Right? We're involved in profound fucking shit. Right? And in a way, the criticism against philosophy that the poets made was right. When Aristophanes says to the audience, philosophy is a threat to the city. They want to destroy your traditions. He was right. First, it seems, we must supervise the maker of tales, and if they make a good one, it must be approved, but if not, it must be rejected. Most of those, here we go, Socrates says, most of the poems they now tell, the Homeric poems, most of the poems, most of the myths, most of the ones they now tell must be thrown out. Okay, understand, what must be thrown out? The poems and the tales of what? The Homeric tradition. There's no more Athens now. Which sort, Glaucon said. I said, middle of the page, 4 lines down, Socrates says, which ones do we have to throw out? Glaucon says. Socrates says, 4 lines down, the ones Hesiod and Homer told us. Those have to be thrown out. The ones Hesiod and Homer told us, and the other poets too. They surely composed false tales for human beings and used to tell them and still do. But what sort, Glaucon said, and what do you mean to blame in them? Socrates says, what ought to be blamed first and foremost? I said, Socrates says, I'll tell you what should be fucking blamed in the poems of the Homeric traditions, in the poems of Hesiod, in the poems of Sophocles. I'll tell you. Especially if the lie says, we ought to be blamed. What ought to be blamed first and foremost, I said? Especially if the lie a man tells isn't a good one. So again, noble lie, bad lie. The philosophers are going to tell noble lies, and they're good lies. And why are they good? Because they help people who can't be self-governing. What's that? So the first thing that has to go. When a poet in speech makes a bad representation of what gods and heroes are like. When Homer and Hesiod make bad representations of what the gods are like. First, I said, a couple lines down. First, I said, the first lie that has to go, the first poet who has to go is Homer. The whole damn tradition has to go. First, Socrates said, the man who told the biggest lie about the things didn't even tell a good lie. How Uranus did what Hesiod says he did, and how Kronos in his turn took revenge on him, and Kronos' deeds and his suffering at the hands of his son. Not even if these things were true, Socrates says, would I suppose they should so easily be told to thoughtless young people. Best would be to keep quiet. But if there were some necessity to tell as few as possible. Only few can know. All right? And Adamantus says later on, he says, my God, these are really, this is harsh what you are doing, Socrates. And Socrates says, yes, these things mustn't be spoken in our city, I said, nor must it be said within the hearing of a young person that in doing the extremes of injustice, or that in punishing the unjust deeds of his father in every way, he would do nothing to be wondered at, but would be only doing what the first and the greatest of the gods did. Remember, Euthyphro went to indict his father on charges of impiety because he was imitating Zeus. This is the core of the problems. In the Antigone and Creon have fundamentally correct but competing claims to what the gods want of them. Correct? The gods war amongst themselves. This is the source. The Homeric traditions are the source of the crisis in individuals, in families, and in cities. Above all, Socrates says, above all, it mustn't be said that the gods make war on gods and plot against them and have battles with them, for it isn't even true. And we certainly, right? It mustn't be said that gods make war on other gods, provided, because remember, this is potentially the education for the guardians, provided that those who are going to guard the city for us must consider it most shameful to be easily angry with one another. Again, you got to know who your friends are and know who your enemies are. Middle of the page, mid-sentence. And all the battles of the gods Homer made, right? The whole damn Homeric tradition. And all the battles of the gods Homer made must not be accepted in our city, whether they are made with a hidden sense or without a hidden sense. A young thing can't judge what is a hidden sense and what is not. But he takes into his opinions at that age, has a tendency to become hard to eradicate and unchangeable. Perhaps it is for this reason that we must do everything to ensure that they hear first with respect to virtue to be the finest tales for them to tell. And he goes on and says a few more things. We have to educate the guardians. That's going to require poetry. And we have to invent a new poem, a new myth, and educate them when they're very young. And we must censor the myths and we must censor the poems so they understand, because they're not capable of doing it on their own, exactly who they are, what they owe to the city, and who their friends are. And this poem is a form of a noble lie. It's irony. It's the saying of one thing with the intention of another. It's a lie. But it's done for the benefit of the person to whom, in this case, the guardians, and the rest of the city to which you're lying. Why? Because they're not capable of understanding what to do on their own, ultimately. And we have to educate, we have to brainwash them. All right. Let's stop there. We were going to do book 3 on Tuesday. And then we'll have a little holiday. Have a fabulous Thursday. Have a fabulous weekend. Love all of you very much. Miss seeing you guys in person. It's heartbreaking. But I'm very proud of you and us and what we're doing. So have a great day. Have a great weekend. And we'll see you on Tuesday for book 3. And then we continue. Love you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Love you guys.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Professor.
Have a good
Yep.
trip.